I'm David Davis. I am the Agriculture Extension Agent and Cooperative Extension Director here in Yancey County, North Carolina Cooperative Extension of Yancey County. And this is the first of a series of garden classes. I will be conducting these classes on Tuesday mornings, 10 a.m. live. We're doing this in a hybrid format. So if you can't join us in person, you can join us by Zoom at 10 a.m. And if you're busy during the day and you're not available at that time, you can check out these recordings as they'll be posted on our YouTube channel, and you can access them through our website. So please go ahead and register for our upcoming events. We have several classes coming up. Next Tuesday at 10 a.m. will be raised bed gardening. We have a class coming up on growing tomatoes. We have a class coming up on spring vegetables, growing spring vegetables. We're planning some classes all the way through April and May, with exception of a couple Tuesdays because I have conflicting workshops at that same time. But check out all of our offerings on our website. It's also going to be announced in our newsletter. But today we're talking about home composting and how can you successfully establish a home composting system? So thank you for joining me, but let's jump into our presentation. So first of all, what is composting? Composting essentially converts organic materials like leaves, kitchen scraps, and garden waste into a valuable product. We take something that is relatively useless, that normally goes into the landfill or gets thrown out or gets discarded, and we turn it into a product that we can use to benefit the soil, or benefit our garden plants and our landscapes, our yards, however we use this product. Basically, composting takes waste from your kitchen or your garden and turns it into valuable black gold that you can use to help to amend your soil and make it healthier for your plants. There's several benefits to composting. First of all, compost can be incorporated in the soil, which increases your organic matter content. It improves the physical properties of the soil. It makes your soil, it will keep it from compacting. It will also help plant roots to be able to grow through the soil better. It just improves the soil structure overall. It makes it easier to work the soil when you're working the garden, when it's not compacted. And also, compost, adding that organic matter content, helps to release nutrients much slower, and so you can use those throughout the season instead of having a burst of nutrients released to the plants all at once right after you plant in a rainstorm or something. Compost helps retain those nutrients so they release slowly over time. A compost can bring and feed diverse wildlife or diverse life into the soil. And primarily, we're talking about microbes, things like earthworms, beneficial insects, fungi, mycorrhizae, all those things that are really good for our plants and for our soils and for soil health. Compost helps to maintain the soil temperature. It keeps your soil temperature from having extremes, and so it can keep soil cooler in the summer months, and it can keep soil warmer in the early spring months to help your plants, help that soil environment, that soil temperature, to optimize plant growth. Compost can help suppress plant diseases and weeds and pests. If you use compost on the surface and you mulch with it, you can prevent soil splash. You can keep all kinds of diseases and things from splashing up on the plants. Compost encourages healthy root systems. You're encouraging the right microbial growth and development, and also all of those critters like earthworms and things in the soil. You're loosening up the soil. It makes it easier for roots to grow through the soil profile and the soil layer. And you're also making sure that nutrients are available, sufficient airspace down in that root zone, and also plenty of nutrient and water holding capacity. Adding compost can reduce the use of fertilizers and pesticides. You can add some very good compost, which can reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizer you need to use, or even organic amendments if you're an organic gardener. And so adding compost can be used as a nutrient source where you don't have to add so much of the other more expensive inputs. Composting also reduces the waste stream. By far, plant food scraps are the biggest source of landfill refuse. It's the biggest source of our garbage. And we can reduce our waste quite a bit. What's going into the landfill, what's being wasted. We can reduce fuel costs because there's less to transport. You drop your garbage off at the local convenience center. It's got to be transported to our local landfill here in Yancey County. It's put on a truck and it's transported elsewhere to where it's usually incinerated, or maybe to another landfill or something like that. And so you're reducing fossil fuel use. So you're reducing that waste stream. And so that's why one of the reasons we encourage composting is it's just much better for the environment. It reduces methane. And so when all this goes into the landfill, methane, of course, is released when things are buried, or as product breaks down. As food scraps break down in our garbage, methane's released, and we, of course, know that methane contributes to climate change through the greenhouse effect. And so we want to reduce as much methane as possible from going into the atmosphere. Composting is one way that we can do that. Applying compost can also help reduce nutrient runoff. When you apply nitrogen fertilizers to your garden, they're in high concentration. And a lot of times you're applying those nutrients in the quantity of nutrients that you're applying is much greater than what plants actually need. And so you can accumulate those nutrients in the soil. And when you have heavy rain, it's not being used by plants, it's just sitting there. Things like phosphorus, in particular, nitrogen, they can all get into our water because they're in such excess when they run off. Composting, of course, will not only just reduce the amount of excess nutrients that are in the soil, but it will also slow water runoff. As the water runs, it slows as it hits the compost, and it keeps those nutrients there where your plants can use them. Adding composting to your home gardening efforts can save on transport costs. I've already touched on this a bit, but there's transport cost in everything. If you're purchasing fertilizers, if you're having to purchase pesticides, all those things have to be transported, and they're transported from a factory to a warehouse back to the store. And if we can lessen those inputs, that's one way that will reduce transport and fuel costs. And of course, by not transporting your food scraps in the garbage, that's another way we reduce transport costs. This is the goal of composting. A lot of times this is what you want to end up with the end product. You want to have compost that's dark brown or black. It's crumbly, it's humus, it's rich, and it smells like soil. It shouldn't smell rotten. You shouldn't be able to pick out those food scraps that were placed in it if the product's actually finished. And even if you're using wood chips or sawdust or leaves or whatever, you shouldn't be able to pick out the products that went into your compost pile. You should end up with this homogeneous mixture that looks like soil, heavy humus or organic matter, and it should smell really good. It should smell like soil that you want to put into your raised beds. So a few considerations before starting your own home compost pile. You want to determine your needs based on the amount of organic materials that you have. We'll talk about two different composting methods, and the amount of organic materials, primarily talking about sources of nitrogen. So this will be your food scraps. We'll talk about greens and browns. We're primarily talking about greens. Browns are usually in ready supply. I mean, we can find plenty of leaves in our area. We can find sawdust easily accessible at little to no cost. We can find wood chips. We can find newspaper clippings. And so browns are carbon carbon source products are really not that hard to find. However, you only eat so much, you only have so many food scraps. So your greens are usually the limited resource. And so what type of composting that you do in your backyard will really depend upon that. How much material do you have to put into your compost bin? You also want to consider the space you have for composting. Um, you don't necessarily want to put your compost bin in your front yard. It's not going to be very visually appealing. We can do a few things. We can build bins and different things like that to make it more visually appealing, but it's usually not going to be too visually appealing. And so you want to think about the space that you have. Do you have some place you can kind of hide that compost bin and yet it be close to the garden and be accessible, and you not have to walk very far to put materials into it? You're also going to need space to store some of your browns, your carbon materials, the things that you're adding in with your food scraps. And so that's important, having some storage space. You also want to consider the degree of effort you're willing to put into your composting process. Um, you can do little, you can do a lot. The more you can do, the better your compost will be. The quicker that you can turn over a compost pile from the ingredients that you put in it to the end product, the better off you will be. But that quickness takes more effort. And so you want to think about the amount of effort you're willing to put into this. Is this really something that you want to keep up? Are you going to be willing to go out there and turn that compost pile once a week or once every 2 or 3 days? So really think about that. All these are considerations to help you determine if you want to do home composting. Also, it's considerations to determine what kind of composting you want to do. And we'll get into that more here in just a moment. Where do you locate your pile or bin? Find a flat open space. It's easily accessible. You want to be able to get into it to add your food scraps, so not too far from the kitchen, or not too far from wherever you store your food scraps. And like I said, keep it in areas where the front and above are clear. You don't want to put it back in the forest, for instance, where things can get down in it, can fall down in it that you don't want. You want to have control over what goes into your bin. Also, shady area is a little bit more preferable because in a shady area, your compost pile won't dry out as quickly. You also want your compost bin to be adjacent to the garden where compost will be used and it'll be readily available. There's basically two basic styles of composting in traditional composting. We'll also touch a little bit on a third method, which is vermicomposting. It's really more of a niche method. But the two styles of traditional composting will be a single compost pile where you add materials only once to form that pile. It's the most efficient. It has the quickest results. Sometimes there's revolving drum and tumbler bins that work best for a single compost pile. Most people are probably doing batch composting. And this is where you add materials as they become available. And we're mostly talking about the greens again, your food scraps. You're only adding materials in low amounts in the bin. And so this method will take more time. You got to think about it. It takes time for compost to be to develop. It takes time for things to break down, for your food scraps to break down, for the microbes to do what they need to do in the composting process. And so batch composting really, it takes a lot more time to do that. But due to the low amounts of material being available with your greens and your food scraps, a lot of times batch composting is what you're going to end up doing in a home garden situation. If you want to really increase your compost in your backyard, maybe get with a neighbor or a neighbor or two around you and start collecting food scraps, and maybe a community effort to go more of a single compost pile. You can also make multiple areas, but you need enough material to make sure you have a big enough compost pile. One of the things you might do is maybe go to a local produce stand or a local farmer and get some of their extras, pick up some of the scraps from the cull pile, You may be able to do that so that you have enough food scrap material to add to your own compost pile to do single compost batches. Some optional equipment that you may need in this process: some thick gardening gloves as you handle your materials, your greens, your browns, as you're handling tools, and then, before you get to the finished product, sifting that compost, garden gloves are going to be very handy. A garden fork or something with metal tines and a reinforced handle is going to be pretty important for turning the compost pile. There's some optional stuff, an aerator, which basically resembles a screw, or butterfly clips. This is not essential. You don't have to have it. Garden fork works just fine, but you may consider purchasing an aerator for your compost pile to make it easier to turn and aerate your pile. Definitely having a water hose nearby, or a good watering can, a water source, because most of the time the pile will dry out and you will have to add some moisture back to it throughout the process. Having containers or buckets to carry compost or food scraps, or to add materials to your bin to be able to measure things out, that's pretty important. Having some kind of screener, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. A flat shovel or a tapered spade is really good to help turn your compost, to move it to your garden, and also a wheelbarrow. You'll need a wheelbarrow, especially late in the composting process when you're moving out your finished compost to a storage area. You want to have something where you can easily move compost back and forth from where you're using it in your garden, lawn, or landscape. And a wheelbarrow works good for that. So what does your pile need? Basically, composting is pretty simple. We basically take organic materials, which would be like our food scraps, our nitrogen sources. We need microorganisms, so bacteria or fungi, and these microorganisms are what does the work for you. And so you have to have them in the compost pile. We have to have moisture, and we have to have air. The recipe for composting, this very simple recipe here of using these materials, not necessarily recipe, but materials list. It's very simple. You take these four things: moisture, air, bacteria, microorganisms, bacteria and fungi, and a little bit of organic materials, greens and browns, and you can turn it into a very good compost product. So here, throughout the rest of this presentation, just a disclaimer: microorganisms, when I'm referring to microorganisms, so both bacteria and fungi, I'm probably going to use the term microbes. And so we just want to make you aware that when I say that, we're talking about bacteria and fungi, probably even some insects, earthworms, those kinds of things that can work their way into the compost pile to help with the decomposition process. What can you compost? We typically, I've already mentioned this a couple times, but we typically separate our materials into greens and browns. Browns are ingredients that are high in carbon. Greens would be ingredients that are high in nitrogen. And so if you read any thing on composting, you will often hear these books talk about greens and browns, and talk about manipulating your carbon to nitrogen ratio. And this is very important to consider in the composting process. So our browns would be things like carbon-rich materials such as leaves or dead tree leaves, twigs, non-glossy paper, so newspaper, corn cobs, hay or straw, cotton balls or swabs, dryer lint, cardboard, sawdust, bark or wood chips, grains, cereals, and crackers. The one thing I'll say on here, notice that it doesn't say branches, or it doesn't say pieces of stove wood. Size matters. We'll talk about that more in just a minute, but we're talking about more twigs, leaves, those kinds of things, non-glossy paper. This would be newspaper, or, it's not, we're in political season. It's not the political ads that you're going to get, the mailers that you're going to get that are going to be very glossy. You want the non-glossy, as it'll break down, and you don't want to put different chemicals and things. It might be in some of those treated advertisements. And a lot of times the glossy paper, it just won't break down as readily. Now on this list, the things that I like to use the most for my sources of brown: sawdust. Works really great. Wood chips works really great, or bark. That's usually my go-to. A few that you want to be careful of course, any cotton balls or swabs that you've used for personal hygiene purposes, be mindful of that. You don't necessarily want that into your compost bin for food safety reasons. A few others on here that I'd be wary of, hay and straw in particular. You want to make sure that that's seed free, because that can create problems later on when you want to use this in your garden or landscape. You don't want to have weed seed in there that you're going to seed into your garden. It's going to cause problems. So my go-to is sawdust. It's readily available. You can go here to a sawmill here in the county, in Yancey County, and you can get it for little to no cost. Wood chips, there's usually a lot of trees being chipped, bark being chipped. In the live session that we had, somebody asked about walnut. You know, I would be careful with walnut roots. Dead walnut material is probably going to be okay, but use common sense. We know that walnut produces a compound that will keep some plants from growing. It's toxic to plants. You can't grow a whole lot near walnut trees, and that is the concern. So there are a few concerns like that you want to think of. Is the material I'm putting in my compost, is it going to be harmful to plants? The same thing when you're considering your greens, which are your nitrogen-rich materials. You can use green leaves, grass clippings work well, fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, tea bags, herbivorous animal manure. You don't want to use pet manure, but things like cow manure, horse manure, those kinds of manures, rabbit manure. If you have a small, some rabbit cages or some pet rabbits, or even if you're producing some meat rabbits or something like that, chicken manure is fine if you can collect it. The one thing I will say, if you're getting manure from a neighbor, be mindful, especially with horse manure, if they purchased hay. So if somebody has one or two horses or something, they had them in stalls and barns, that kind of thing, and they purchase their hay, be mindful that hay can be treated with herbicides before it's harvested. It doesn't hurt the animals, but it can accumulate in the manure. And so you can have several different herbicides that don't break down, even passing through an animal, or even composting in a barn. They just don't go away. And those will often bioaccumulate. And if you get that chemical in your compost pile, it can be hazardous to any plants that you put your end product on. So I'm weary of horse manure just a little bit, unless I know the hay source hasn't been treated with some of those herbicides. So it's something you might want to consider. Cow manure in an old barn, if you can find it in a barn or a stall or working facility from a neighbor, if you have it on your property, maybe you have a farm or something like that, works great. And like I said, rabbit manure, chicken manure, all that works very great to go in the compost pile as your green source. You can use egg shells. I would stay away from eggs. We'll talk about some products we don't want to use here in just a moment and why. Of course, flowers, dead blossoms, old herbs and spices, even hair, fur, feathers, and nail clippings could go on this list. Do you notice it doesn't say old vegetable plants out of the garden if your compost is going back into the garden? Your home compost pile is probably not going to heat up enough to kill disease pathogens. And so I would avoid putting, vegetable plants from the garden back into your home compost pile. You're much better off to chop those up in your beds, or remove those from raised beds, or in traditional garden, chop those up, till them in, those kinds of things, so that they decay. Do that in the fall of the year so that they decay through the winter in the garden. You can add organic matter that way. But I would avoid putting those old plants, diseased plants, that kind of stuff from your vegetable garden back into your compost pile, just because of disease concerns. Typically, you want to have 3 brown to 1 green. That's the ideal ratio for rapid composting. So, 3 to 1, when you're talking by weight or by volume is what you're going for. Here are a few things that you don't want to compost. Do not put meat, bones, fish, milk products, eggs, and oils. These can produce odors, but more importantly, they can attract animals. And you don't want to attract skunks, possums, raccoons, and rodents. You don't want to attract these to your compost bin. And all these products, these types of food scraps, you're better off to dispose of them in your regular disposal in your garbage. Pet feces, it's a concern. You know, you don't want to put pet feces into your compost pile, mostly because of pathogens. Your pets can carry pathogens that can make you sick, and your compost pile probably is not going to heat up enough to kill those pathogens. Any kind of plant material treated with herbicides, as I mentioned before, with the horse manure concern. You know, you want to be careful if you have your lawn treated. You don't necessarily want to put grass clippings after that treatment has occurred with a herbicide, because you don't want to get that into compost, put it out on your plants, and kill your plants. Pressure treated lumber has some toxic chemicals. You know, so you don't want to put up any chipped lumber or anything like that that might have been pressure treated. Even I would even be wary of sawdust if you build a deck or something like that using pressure treated lumber. I'd just be wary of that. Lime, you don't want to add that to your compost pile, besides it messing with the microbes, because lime can mess with the pH, can also cause ammonia gas release, and we don't want that to happen. We want to keep nitrogen in the pile. We don't want it to volatilize into the atmosphere from our compost pile. Disease, plants and leaves, like I mentioned, you don't want to spread disease when you put this back into your landscape, lawn, or garden. Persistent weeds, weeds heavy with seed, invasive weeds, those kinds of things. You know, the weed seed getting in there, or plant parts. If you put, say, you have dig up some Bermuda grass or maybe some English ivy or something like that that reproduces vegetatively, you don't want to add that back to your compost pile, because you don't want to spread that around. Things that you don't want to spread, you don't want to put in there. Weeds to keep out of the compost pile would include things like seeded weeds, you know, heavily seeded weeds. Could also include others that have very invasive roots. So dock, alligator weed, Bermuda grass, all those would be examples of plants from your landscape, or, you know, that you may take out of your lawn or garden, that you may dig out, that you don't want to put back into the compost pile. So here's how to build a batch compost pile. You want it to be the final size, or the end size of your compost pile. You want it to be at least 1 cubic yard, or 3 cubic feet minimum. So here's kind of how you build that. Basically, if you're going with 1 cubic yard, you're looking at 4 inches of tangled branches on the bottom to help with drainage and airflow, increases in aeration. 4 to 5 inches of browns, a layer of that, 2 to 3 inches of greens, and that'll get you your 3-to-1 ratio that we talked about earlier. And you want to layer this, alternate layers until you get to the full size of you fill the bin. A handful of soil. The soil contains those microbes, the bacteria and fungi, and this is a good way to inoculate your compost pile. And then make sure you top with 4 to 5 inches of browns. This keeps odors down. It helps retain moisture. So you want to finish off your compost pile with browns. So wherever you're stopping it at, just make sure that browns are the first and the last layer. You're kind of sealing in your greens, so to speak. Particle size is very important when you think about your compost bin. Most of the materials that you put in should be 2 inches or less. If you don't do this, things will compost. It just takes much more time. And so food scraps, you should chop those up. If you're using bark or you're using wood chips, just make sure that the particle size is less than 2 inches. Basically, what you're going for, these small particles have more surface area, and surface area is key to composting quickly and decomposing quickly. It allows the microbes to get better access, and you're really going for that surface area. If particles are too big, the process will take longer. You may have, especially on your browns, if you use large size wood chips or things that are too big, it may not break down by the time you finish everything else. And so particle size does matter. And even on your greens, if you can chop things up, instead of somebody asked in the live class about cucumbers or other produce in the refrigerator that had started to decompose already. Maybe it's molded, maybe it's, liquefied. Things can get pretty nasty in the refrigerator. It happens. but this material's fine. I mean, put it in there. It's mushy. It's going to break down probably when you throw it in the bin or you put it in a bucket to carry it to your compost pile or a bin or whatever you use. It's probably going to come apart anyways. But other things, if you have lettuce or, maybe leftover salad and you're putting it in the compost bin and it's not really started to decompose, or out of date, vegetable products or herbs or something like that, just make sure you chop it up into smaller pieces. And I'm thinking about things like, pineapples. Pineapples are pretty large, melons, those kinds of things. Don't just put a whole half of a melon that you had cut into the compost bin. Chop it up to increase that surface area. You can do that right at the bin or in your bucket or whatever, just to increase that particle size. Particle size is really more of a concern, though, on the browns. That's really the biggest issue if you're using things like wood chips. 1-inch wood chips will decompose much slower than grains of sawdust. So I like the sawdust. That's what I would use in my home compost bin. Like I said, it's readily available. Things like newspaper, make sure it's shredded. Don't just put the whole piece of paper in there. Shredded or torn up or whatever will decompose much quicker. Leaves, don't put whole leaves in your compost bin. If you make this nice matted layer, it will take forever to really decompose. You can shred fallen leaves by piling them up in the yard and just mowing over them before you rake them up or before you collect them with a mower. That works really well. It's going to reduce that particle size. So adding in shredded leaves versus whole leaves will really help out. How much moisture is needed? Basically, our microbes, we're going for aerobic decomposition. So we need some air, we need some oxygen. So we don't want to saturate the pile to where oxygen can't get in the pore space. And if you get the pile too wet, that's what happens. You saturate it and you end up with more anaerobic or, microbes that don't use oxygen, that are decomposers. You don't want that. Anaerobic decomposition, that's what gives you smell. That's essentially a rot. We want aerobic because we don't want the smells and we want good product being formed. That does require some moisture, so you don't want the pile to get too dry. The microbes need moisture to work. The pile should be 40 to 60% moisture. So basically a test of this is to pick up the material, kind of like you do a ribbon test in the garden to see if you're going to plow or work the soil. Squeeze it in your hand. It should feel like a wrung out sponge. And so you shouldn't have water dripping out of your hand when you squeeze the material. But again, it shouldn't crumble to the point that it feels like sawdust or sand or something like that that's really dry. It shouldn't crumble up. It should kind of stick together. So that wrung out sponge feel is a good way to describe it. Talk just a minute about slow or cold composting. This is the majority of what happens with a home compost bin because you just don't want to, have to do all the turning. And, with slow or cold composting, a lot of times you can use, say, a pile of leaves. A pile of leaves is a great way to make compost. However, this slow or cold composting, which is what would happen, it's much slower. And so slow or cold composting, the decomposition will happen, but it will take sometimes up to a year for that to happen. So this slow or cold composting method, you can get a 3 to 5 foot pile of leaves, add some food waste, but make sure you encase that food waste in browns, and then you just kind of leave it. Be mindful that this method, however, may take or may bring in more critters because you may have those smells. Slow or cold composting, the food scraps, the food waste doesn't go away as quickly. And so it's there. You may bring in rodents, you may bring in other critters. So you want to be mindful of that. This process does not kill any pathogens or weeds. So you want to be mindful of what you put into the compost bin if you're really using more of this slow or cold composting method. And essentially, when you're using your home compost pile, because most of us just don't have enough of the green material at once. You don't have enough food scraps. You're putting it in slowly over time. You end up slow or cold composting. The pile's usually small. You don't have a sufficient compost pile size for it to heat up the way that it needs to. And you're not going to want to work it of what it takes to do faster hot composting. You're not going to want to turn the pile every 2 or 3 days or once a week. So you're just kind of leaving it there. And so this really is more of a slow or cold composting method. Another thing you can do if you have a lot of leaf material, if you don't have enough food waste, you can add nitrogen fertilizer, which I know that kind of defeats the purpose. You can add bone meal, you can add blood meal as a nitrogen source, and you can essentially speed up that decomposition process. Remember that in decomposition, the nitrogen is what's feeding that microbe population. And so it's kind of the same concept. If you put raw manure on your garden, the microbes that are breaking down that manure will actually consume more nitrogen than what will be available to the plants. That's why we don't recommend raw manure. We recommend composted manure if you're applying manure to a garden to add organic matter. The same concept here. These microbes are going to use up that nitrogen. Even in the end, you will have some nitrogen available in the final product, but most of the nitrogen that you're putting in there in your greens, it's being used up by the microbes. And that's really what speeds up that process. You're feeding that microbial population. You're getting it, you're getting the population up large enough, big enough so that they're able to break that down quickly. And that takes us into hot composting. This is really what you're using for certified compost producers. So anybody in Kentucky, we had a group that would take horse manure and they would charge horse farms to collect the manure. They would haul it to a composting facility. They would add wood chips and various wooded material, primarily wood chips or mulch. Kind of like this picture that you see here. They would pile it up. They had these machines that would turn the compost pile. When I was an agent in Kentucky, I got to see this quite a bit. And basically, they were testing that compost to make sure it met certification requirements. If you purchase compost, say from a local landscape supply place, and it's a compost like this, it's a certified compost. It's gone through this fast or hot composting process, and so we look at this, some advantages to fast and hot composting. To do this, it takes a more precise management of the carbon to nitrogen ratio. It takes precise management of moisture and aeration. This is the quickest way of generating compost, but you're probably not going to be able to do much hot composting in your backyard because you have a limited supply of those green materials, and your pile is probably going to be small. It's going to be smaller in size. The pile size really matters as well for fast or hot composting. If in fast or hot composting, it takes about 3 to 5 months to get finished compost. It's really dependent on the time of the year. 5 months in the winter months because ambient temperature is cooler. 3 months in the summer months because it's warmer and the pile will heat up more quickly. But in your backyard, it is hard to maintain constant hot temperatures. You want to keep those ratios right of carbon to nitrogen so that it provides a faster product so that the pile will heat up more. But if you're going to try to do fast or hot composting, you really have to check that temperature every day. Turning helps to keep the temperature up. Aerating the pile or turning the pile helps to keep that temperature up. And so you really have to monitor it very closely. How hot should the pile get in hot composting? Heat will be given off as those organisms feed on waste. The most efficient temperature, look at that, it has to be 131 degrees to kill pathogens. If your pile gets up, it has to get up to 145 degrees to kill most weed seeds. However, if you get up above 160, it's going to kill your microbes and it's going to slow the process. So you don't want to get it that warm. Typically, we're going for a range of 90 to 140 degrees or 145 degrees if you could get there. However, backyard composting often does not reach the high temperatures. It's very seldom that you reach 131 degrees Fahrenheit in a small backyard pile. This is really more of a commercial compost setting. So just be mindful of that. How often should you aerate? The frequency is going to depend on the moisture. It's going to depend on the carbon to nitrogen ratio, your green to browns. How close to that ideal ratio have you been able to come? However, generally once a week is usually adequate. If you add more greens, you can do that more often. You could do that start out once every 2 days, and then after a couple of weeks, go to once every 3 days. And that's going to allow your pile to heat up more. It's going to allow decomposition to happen more quickly, but it's also a lot of work, right? So a lot of folks don't want to do that. If you can aerate once a week, that's ideal. Aeration is the key to heating up a pile to keep it going. It's adding oxygen. Most active or air, we talked about aerobic decomposition. It takes place at the center of the pile. So the goal is to work material into the center of that pile. How do you activate the compost? Basically, decomposition is spontaneous. Microbes are in the environment. Usually materials are covered in enough microbes that decomposition will inevitably start, but you can quicken this process by adding microbes. So basically you want to do that by adding soil. Don't purchase inoculants. That's a waste of money. A handful of soil, or once you get your composting process going, add in a handful or two of your previous compost mixture. You can also add bone meal, blood meal, or grain meal. Honestly, this is going back to that idea that I mentioned earlier of adding fertilizer. You're adding more nitrogen source to it, basically to increase those inoculants, to increase that microbial activity, and to promote an environment, give them plenty of nitrogen to feed on so that the population just burst. But when you first start your pile, a handful of good old garden soil is just fine. It's very, very easy to do. Add it in layers. I like to add a handful of soil every time I add a layer of greens in my compost pile. So that's what I would recommend. Maintaining the compost pile, you want to keep it cooking, right? You want to keep it heating. Maintaining moisture is the biggest concern here. If you don't have moisture, the microbes won't survive. The aerobic decomposers, the microbes that you want in your pile won't survive. And so you got to keep that moisture content uniform. Your finished compost should be a rich brown uniform size with a pleasant earthy aroma when it's done. And so watering and turning the pile regularly, that will help you get to that desired end product. Loosen it when you turn it. Every time you turn the pile, don't just turn it over, but also loosen it with your fork. You want to move the top and the sides again closer to the center. You want to move the center of the pile to the outside, and that basically just ensures that the pile is homogeneous, that things are decomposing at the same rate throughout the pile, and you're not having part of the pile decomposing a lot and material left on the outside that's not decomposing as readily. How long does it take to compost? If you don't turn, if you don't aerate, if you don't watch moisture, it can take a year, and that's if you get the greens to browns correct. Okay. It may take longer if you have too many browns and the pile dries out too much. If you aerate, several months. Again, at least 5 months, maybe 5 to 8 months is typically what you're looking at with a backyard compost pile. 3 to 4 months if you're diligent. And this would be like turning the pile on the second day, then the fourth day, then every 3 days until the batch is finished. Most people don't want to do that. Most home gardeners don't want to do that. But if you really want to get into this, that's what it would take to get it the quickest. So let's talk about a little bit about using this compost out of traditional compost before we go into vermicomposting. How should you use the final product? I mean, it's a great product, right? How should you use it? Well, you don't want to use it until the pile cools to around 10 degrees, plus or minus 10 degrees within the ambient temperature. And this is because if it's warmer than that, that's telling you that that aerobic decomposition is still happening. And remember what I mentioned before about nitrogen. You don't want to add unfinished compost to your garden or landscape because it will actually deplete nitrogen and make it less available to your plants. So you want to wait till the pile cools. You also want that black uniform color or brown uniform color. You want it to have a pleasant, earthy aroma. If it's smelling, if it's smelling rotten, if it's stinking, that tells you that it's not composted yet. It's not done. So you want it to smell more like soil. It's ready for use once it's cured. You can do a germination test to test it out to see how well it'll do. However, as you're storing compost, you do want to periodically moisten and lightly mix your finished product. This just helps keep nutrients uniform throughout the pile. It keeps things from drying out, keeps nitrogen from volatilizing off your compost pile. You want to keep that nitrogen tied up into that compost as much as possible. It is important to screen your compost when it's done. Screen out the larger materials. Using a hardware cloth and a wood frame works very well. You can use other things, rabbit wire. You can make a frame out of that. I wouldn't use a chicken wire. It's too big. Or like woven wire, something like that for larger livestock. Getting a piece of that. That's really too big. You really need it to be about an inch if possible or smaller. You want to sift the compost, remove the larger uncomposted material. You want to return that to the pile. It's another good way of inoculating the pile. Let's talk a little bit about using the compost in the landscape. Use only finished compost. Again, basically mulch 1 to 3 inches in like a vegetable bed annually. Something you're going to plant into. Incorporate that into the soil. Don't just leave it on top. You can also use it to mulch with once your vegetables are growing in the season, and you can leave that on top 1 to 2 inches. Avoid using compost made from vegetable scraps in a vegetable garden. Primarily, this is because your compost pile probably did not heat up to 131 degrees to kill those pathogens. And you don't want to seed your vegetable garden with disease. And that's the concern here. I've used compost from my vegetable scraps before in my home garden, but there is a risk. So we don't recommend that, officially don't recommend that, because you could possibly transmit plant diseases to your vegetable garden. It's better to use purchased compost or amendments for your vegetable garden, and there are plenty of compost products out there. Mushroom compost, compost manure. There are lots of products out there. If you want to learn more about some locally available stuff, come to the raised bed class next week at 10 a.m. Also hybrid format, or check out the video if it's after the fact. So using home compost made from vegetable scraps, you're better off to use this around trees or other areas throughout the landscape. The idea is that there's not as many pathogens that will go from the vegetables to the trees or shrubs. And so if you're using that capacity, you're making use of the product, your home compost product, but you're not taking the risk of getting disease, of transmitting disease from your vegetable scraps onto your vegetable garden. When you're using it, basically apply 2 inches of compost from the drip line of a tree to a few inches from the trunk. The same would go for shrubs. Just the same as when you're using mulch, regular hardwood mulch. You don't want a volcano mulch with a compost. You don't want to pile it in all around the roots. You want it all around the drip line of that tree, where those feeder roots are, where all those nutrients will go into the soil and it will benefit the plant. You can make a compost tea. We've had some questions about this over the years. Compost tea has plenty of nutrients and can have beneficial microbes. Basically, when you're making compost tea, you want to use 1 part compost to 10 parts water, but you want to put that in a fine mesh fabric bag. You don't really want those loose compost ingredients in your tea. You want to get the nutrients and the microbes, but not necessarily the bulk material. You pour that around your soil and your plants. We do not recommend applying that to the edible portions of a plant. So, don't put compost tea on your lettuce, for instance, that you're ready to harvest, or pouring it out there on squash or tomatoes or strawberries or anything where the fruit's already developed. Use it earlier in the season, pour it on plants earlier in the season. And this is because of inherent food safety risk. If the water is chlorinated, you need to first let the chlorine evaporate when you're making compost tea. You can do this by filling the bucket with water and letting it set for at least 24 hours. You want to measure the compost to make sure you have the desired solid to water ratio. Place the compost in the mesh fabric bag when you're making it, which can be easily removed later. Place a stick across the top of the bucket and tie the fabric bag onto the stick. Submerge that into the bucket of water, and you'll make your tea pretty easily. The chlorinated water is an issue because you don't want to kill your beneficial microbes. Do you need a compost bin? No, not necessarily. Compost can be made in open piles. You don't have to have a fancy bin to make compost, but a bin can help keep the piles neat, can help retain moisture. Bins are usually more appropriate in urban settings because they're more aesthetically pleasing. You can incorporate it into your backyard landscape, and it won't look bad to your neighbors. You won't have somebody fussing about your compost pile devaluing the property. So the bins can be beneficial. There are many types of bins. The garbage can bins, but keep in mind these may not hold 1 cubic yard of compost. Concrete block bins, wooden pallet bins, wire mesh bins, all these have been used and very popular. The 3-compartment wooden bin, you can purchase a compost bin, but you can also make that traditionally out of pallets. You can make the 3-compartment bin out of used pallets, usually the cheapest way to go, and it doesn't look too bad either. And you're recycling the pallets, keeping them out of the landfill. You can also purchase commercial compost bins. There's enclosed, there's spherical, there's tumblers, pet manure composting, but again, we're not recommending that. There's in-ground food scrap composting. We'll talk a little bit more about bins in a minute, but here's an example of the 3 bin pallet bin. Very easy to put together, easy to construct. It can work well to put it on the edge of the property, maybe on the back fence in the backyard, something like that. There's an example of a tumbler. Of course, there's many different styles of these. When it comes to these purchase compost bins, though, beware. This picture is from our compost lab at NC State with NC State Extension down in Raleigh. You can see that this learning lab features a lot of backyard compost systems. Honestly, what the research on this has shown is the compost pile works fine. The 3-bin system usually works the best out of any of the bins. Compost pile is really the best for composting, just the plain old pile in the backyard without any bins, just because of the pile size and heating up and easy to turn and all that kind of stuff. But these bins, basically, some of them work okay, others not so much. Some of them are more suited to that batch composting method that we talked about. But they don't produce a whole lot of compost at once. That's the biggest issue. Seems like you do more work with these fancy tumbler bins and things than you do with just a plain old compost pile. Some common problems to look for: if you have a rotten odor, that means you're having anaerobic decomposition instead of aerobic. You need to turn the pile more. It also could be too wet. Maybe you need to add more brown material. If you're having an ammonia odor, you don't have enough browns. It's too high in nitrogen. The pile could also be too wet. Again, add more browns to reduce the moisture as much as possible. If you're having a low pile temperature, you're not getting any temperature on your compost pile. The biggest reason for this is pile size is too small, or it needs more aeration. You may not have enough nitrogen material, enough greens in the pile as well. You may have too many browns. So you can add more material. You can add more greens. You can add more greens and browns. When you add more to the pile, make sure you adjust to maintain that 2 or 3 to 1 carbon nitrogen ratio. You may need to add a source of nitrogen to the pile. You could do this with alfalfa cubes, bone meal, handfuls of nitrogen fertilizer, and so on. You'll need, if you're not getting a temperature, you may need to aerate by turning the pile, moving the material to the center from the outside, and then from the center to the outside. Materials on the outside to the center, of course. This will help heat up that pile a little bit more because it gets the material that needs to break down. It gets those nitrogen sources to the center of the pile and allows it to heat up. So that's kind of it on traditional composting. If you have any questions on that, feel free to email me. I'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation. You can email me questions, but let's jump into vermicomposting. This really is a niche. Vermicomposting involves using red wiggler worm bins. There are ways you can generate quite a bit of compost. There are some bins that you can purchase, but I will warn you, the larger bins are quite expensive. I've seen them range anywhere from $400 for a small tote bin to $1,000 for a larger vermicomposting bin. You do have to have bins for vermicomposting to contain your earthworms primarily. You have to have bedding, your food waste or your nitrogen source. So notice it's very simple. You're basically using your red worms, your bedding, and your food waste. It's really the 3 ingredients you need for vermicomposting. You want to start with red wigglers. You need about 1,000, which is about a pound of red wigglers. Buy it from a worm grower that's growing them for composting purposes. Don't get it from your yard. You don't want to take from your yard. Those are good for your yards, good for your soil. Plus, they're used to your yard environment. They're not used to compost. The ones you're purchasing from a worm grower, they're basically grown for compost. They're grown in that. So you're not really changing the environment. So, they'll survive better. Also, you don't want to purchase bait from a store, for instance, from a bait shop. Many times those are not going to be as viable. They've been set in the cooler. They've been cooled. They're not going to go in there and really do what you need it to do. So purchase from a certified worm grower that's growing worms for vermicomposting. They'll be ready to go. They'll be ready to take off. You can build or buy a worm bin. There are plenty of places out there on the internet, to give you a what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, to give you the layout for how to build a worm bin. It's actually pretty simple. You can purchase one, like I said. Worm bins, usually plastic worm bins. It doesn't have to be plastic. There are wooden worm bins as well. The ones that I've seen that work well are dark plastic. It doesn't have to allow sunlight. Don't try to build one out of clear plastic. Worms like it dark. They like it under the soil. So a dark bin works better. You really need a snap tight lid, but you may have to put holes or whatever in the lid to make sure you have air getting in, oxygen getting into the worms. But you can purchase a worm bin. They're all over the internet. You can purchase them from Amazon, the garden stores. There's lots of different places to purchase worm bins. You can even find them at Lowe's. I've found them at Lowe's and Home Depot and box stores like that, Rural King, whatever, Tractor Supply. I've seen worm bins there. So at certain times of the year, could be easily purchased. As far as the worm bin bedding, you want to choose one of the following. I like to use shredded newspaper or cardboard. Again, don't use waxy paper. Using plain office paper. When I was in Kentucky, I actually had a worm bin in my office, and I shredded some of our office paper and put it in the bin. It worked just fine. Cardboard works good, but it needs to be shredded cardboard. It needs to be shredded pretty finely. So shredded newspaper or shredded paper usually works the best. You can use dead tree leaves. Again, they need to be shredded. And then also putting in a little compost to start the process is a good idea. If you don't have, when you're just getting started, use a little bit of mushroom compost or something like that. Even manure, putting a little bit of manure compost in there can help get those wigglers started. A lot of times you can get kits that include all the starter materials. Maybe not the food scraps, but it could include shredded paper, worms, and a little bit of vermicompost in those kits. You can use your kitchen scraps. It needs to be cut pretty small. I mean, chopped up. You can see in the picture here, here's a bowl of greens and cut up vegetables here, just some collected kitchen scraps, like from a meal where they had salad and some squash and different things like that. But you can use vegetables, fruit, coffee grounds, tea leaves, bread. You want to make sure you wet the bread first, and pasta. You have to completely cover the bedding, cover it completely with bedding. You want to cover the worms and your paper with, or I'm sorry, your food scraps with bedding material. You also want to start with some bedding. So put the bedding in, your food scraps, your worms, and then material on top of that. Do not put these in your worm bin. The same thing: meat, grease, bones, dairy products, cat or dog feces, garlics, onions, or hot pepper, citrus fruits and rinds, or very salty and sugary foods. Now, the first two, obviously, you don't want that smell starting in your worm bin. Meat, grease, bones, dairy products, it could cause that smell, again, for the same reasons traditional composting. Cat or dog feces, of course, that's because of the pathogen concern, human pathogen concern. The rest of these, the garlic, onions, hot pepper, citrus fruits and rinds, very salty or sugary foods, you don't want to put anything in there that's going to cause the worms to have issues. Citrus can make the bin too acidic, which can also attract red mites. Worms are sensitive to salt, and sugar may attract ants. So, you want to avoid those items. Harvesting your vermicompost after 4 to 6 months. You can choose a method: light separation, which is basically what you see there in the picture, spreading it out to separate the worms, your red worms, from your compost. You can use horizontal separation or vertical separation. A lot of times when you purchase a worm bin, it'll have a way to separate out the worms from the material. Some of them have built-in screens. And so there's lots of things out there. You want to separate the compost after a few weeks when you see the vermicompost at the bottom of the bin. Vermicompost is soil-like material. It'll contain earthworm castings or feces and partially decomposed bedding and food scraps. In about 4 months, it'll be time to harvest the vermicompost. You may harvest it by these different methods. So sideways separation, you feed the earthworms on only one side of your worm bin for several weeks. Most of the worms will migrate to that side of the bin. You can remove the vermicompost from the other side of the bin where you've been adding the food scraps and add fresh bedding. You can repeat this process on the other side of the bin after both sides are harvested, and you can begin adding food scraps to both sides of the bin again. Now, the light separations, basically where you're emptying contents out of your worm bin, like you saw in the picture there. You want to put it out on a plastic sheet or maybe a used shower curtain or something like that, where there is strong sunlight or artificial light. Wait about 5 minutes. Scrape the vermicompost off the top layer. The earthworms will keep moving away from the light, and so you can scrape more vermicompost off after 5 minutes or so. After several scrapings, you'll find the worms in clusters. Just pick the worms back and gently return them back into the bin with fresh bedding, with a little bit of the old bedding mixture mixed in. Vertical separation, that before you begin the composting, either by a manufacturing stacking bin or make your own. Purchase 2 identical bins, drilling extra holes in the bottoms. Set one bin aside and vermicompost in the other bin for a few months. When the bedding in the bin fits snug against the bottom of the bin you set aside, simply fit the second bin inside of the first one and begin only feeding in the top bin for several months. Most of the earthworms will move up to the upper bin and to eat, and eventually the lower bin will just contain the compost. Be on the lookout for earthworm egg capsules. They're kind of lemon-like shaped, about the size of a match head, and a shiny appearance. That they have light brownish color. The capsules contain between 2 and 7 baby earthworms. You want to place these back inside of your bin so they can thrive in your bin system. So that kind of finishes up. Vermicomposting is more of a niche thing. Like I said, I may bring back my vermicomposting bin here in my office and just using some food scraps and shredded paper and that kind of thing. It doesn't have an odor. You can use it right there. You can use it inside the house. Um, you can use it just about anywhere, indoors, outdoors, as long as you keep it dry. If you have any questions about vermicomposting or traditional composting, or you just want to talk about your particular situation, here's my contact information. Again, I'm David Davis, County Extension Director and Agriculture Agent for NC State Extension here with North Carolina Cooperative Extension of Yancey County. You can send me an email me any questions that you may have. You can also give us a call here at the office at our phone number listed there, 828 682 6186.